Today's reading is Christianity and the Social Crisis by Walter Rauschenbusch. Walter Rauschenbusch was a Baptist minister and theologian, advocated for the social gospel. Here he explains why he believes Christianity must address social questions. Western civilization is passing through a social revolution unparalleled in history for scope and power. The religious, political, and intellectual revolutions of the past 5 centuries, which together created the modern world, necessarily had to culminate in an economic and social revolution such as is now upon us. By universal consent, this social crisis is the overshadowing problem of our generation. The industrial and commercial life of the advanced nations are in the throes of it. In politics, all issues and methods are undergoing upheaval and realignment as the social movement advances. The vastness and the free sweep of our concentrated wealth on one side, the independence, intelligence, moral vigor, and political power of the common people on the other side, promise a long-drawn grapple of contesting forces which may well make the heart of every American patriot sink within them. It is realized by friend and foe that religion can play and must play a momentous part in this irrepressible conflict. The church, the organized expression of the religious life of the past, is one of the most potent institutions and forces in Western civilization. Its favor and moral influence are wooed by all parties. It cannot help throwing its immense weight on one side or the other. If it tries not to act, it thereby acts, and in any case, its choice will be decisive for its own future.
Thank you, Barbara, for handling that meaty text right there. And Bruce, I just want to say thank you for that gorgeous musical interlude. It's so good to be reminded of how music can tap into our hearts and memory. So I hesitated to select the chalice reading for today's service. Honestly, the title threw me. A chalice lighting for when things aren't okay. How I wish that wasn't true. How I wish it was an anomaly, a response to something specific that happened in our community or in our country that has momentarily set us off center. But the truth is that for many of you and others in this country and the world, things are not okay. And like the author of the chalice lighting said, I cannot pretend and I will not tell you otherwise. And yet, the love that is holding us, the love that is holding all, remains. You may need to search a little harder for it at times. You may need to quiet your mind in spiritual practice, to turn away from the news and turn on music, to engage in something creative, or to hug a loved one or venture out in nature, to be reminded of this love. But it's there. As I've said before, I believe that our congregations in faith are an antidote to cynicism and fear and division that feels prevalent right now. So is moving from complacency and just a weary acceptance to some type of action, no matter how small. We all know that what we feed grows in our mind, in our hearts, and in our spirits. So if we feed fear and despair and division, that's what grows inside us. Every day we have the ability to shift our energy from despair to love, from apathy to care, and to work to create the world we long for. I was recently in LA helping my son find an apartment, which I succeeded with, woo! And our Airbnb was located in West Hollywood. It was on this very busy street next to a super quiet neighborhood of residents and dog parks that would make many of us shudder at the cost of living there. Earlier this summer, I was in Portland, Oregon for our Unitarian Universalist General Assembly, and both cities have a very present homeless population. Encampments like we may discover in areas that are kind of visible or tucked away in the Twin Cities are everywhere in those cities. The daily reminders of the has and have-nots which thrive under capitalism was soul-crushing. The weight of not knowing how to respond or if there is any humane solution to deal with this issue. It just felt impossible to ignore. And that sense of overwhelm, which I know so many of us experience at this time, it seized me in my spirit. I'm not a social scientist or a person with any depth of knowledge about how to solve such a societal issue, and yet, as part of this society and this world, I struggle with not knowing or not doing enough or not doing anything, remaining complacent by my inaction. Our faith doesn't have an answer, but it does have a call, and the social gospel movement provided a foundational perspective on the role of the church and the people of faith in the broader society and the world, where things are not always okay. This isn't new. If we're honest, there's never really been a time in our country where things were okay for everyone, and I know right now it feels elevated, but honestly, history moves in this motion. Threads that connect contemporary Unitarian Universalism to the social gospel are woven into the history of early Unitarians and Universalist and progressive Christians, which we were a part of when we were early Unitarians and Universalists, and I would argue we are still today. This morning, I will focus on just a few people who were outspoken about our call, and there are many more in history. You heard a reading this morning by Walter Rauschenberg. In the late 1800s, he was a theologian, late 1800s and early 1900s. He was a theologian and minister who's often cited as the one who sparked the social gospel movement. After completing his training for ministry, he took his first pastorate in New York City with the Second German Baptist Church, and he served immigrants at Hell's Kitchen. His great-grandson said, it really was Hell's Kitchen. He went there, like so many ministers of his time, he went there to try to transform the spirits of the people and evangelize in the way he was taught. But his time there changed him, and he began to challenge the interpretation of the Bible he was familiar with. He asked, what does the Bible say about the life of these people that are being crushed by poverty? I have to, as a pastor, deal with this. I have to deal with the body of these lives. Paul Rauschenberg, Walter's great-grandson, shared in a really interesting interview on Being with Krista Tippett how Rauschenberg went back to the Bible, and he had this great parable. He said, a man was walking through the woods, and all around him were the warbling sounds of songbirds, and yet he didn't hear any because he was a botanist. Hear that again. A man's walking through the woods, he hears these wonderful sounds of warbling songbirds, and he doesn't hear them because he was a botanist. He continues, I think this is a great metaphor for how we approach the Bible. You know, we see there what we are expecting to see, and then when Rauschenberg went back with his eyes opened by the suffering of his congregation, he saw all these calls for social renewal and the idea that the social gospel also dealt with the person and with their lives on this earth, not just the afterlife, but this life. This may not sound that radical in this day and age, but in the late 1800s and early 1900s, churches and theologians were mightily focused on the souls of individuals and what they needed to do in this life in order to ensure salvation in the next. Religious leaders and people turned away from the cries and the evils of society because they had their own interpretation of the Bible, which failed to listen to what was happening around them. Those of us who recognize the subjectivity of religious teachings know that all theologies and interpretations of religious text come from a perspective. They are subjective and they are informed by ideology. Text can be used to call forth justice or to hold firm to old and conservative ideas. We, as people of a liberal faith tradition, we were and we are aligned with liberal Christians of the past and today with progressive people of all faiths and traditions. Rauschenberg believed that the Bible called for a commonwealth of God, or a language you may be more familiar with, for the kingdom of God here on earth. As UU theologian Rebecca Parker says, she was raised Methodist and really informed by Rauschenberg. She said, as a vision for life as God intended it to be. Such a vision called people of faith to become co-workers with God, to bring in the kingdom, to fulfill the prayer, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Parker, as I said, was raised with the social gospel active in her family and her church's life. And as she reflects on Rauschenberg's impact on Christianity, she said, he inspired generations of Christians to work towards making God's commonwealth of justice, abundance, and peace a reality in this world. His focus was on this world, not the next. I don't usually do like encyclopedia.com, but I got to say it offered one of the most succinct descriptions of the power of Rauschenberg's 1907 book titled Christianity and the Social Crisis. 1907, it's a long time ago, which for its first 3 years in publication, it was only second to the Bible in terms of the most popular, top-selling religious text. The article says, the originality and the force of Rauschenberg's analysis lays in his ability to draw out the lives and histories of early Christians from New Testament sources. Instead of plucking quotable passages out of context, Rauschenberg used the Gospels and the epistles to present modern readers with a picture of how the earlier followers of Jesus had sought to live in accordance to his principles. Diana shared one of the parables that we heard as his principles. One example after another demonstrated their commitment to communal care, to meeting the needs of fellow seekers without demanding complete equality of material condition. That history, he argued, provided a powerful lesson for modern Christians, neither retreating from modern industrial life, this was in the height of the Industrial Revolution, nor calling for radical Christian communism. There was a lot going on in the United States at that point. Rauschenberg invited readers to simply respond to the needs of others with love, compassion, generosity, and faith, to live in community as Jesus had taught. Unitarian Universalist historian David Bumbaugh says the social gospel movement shifted the role of progressive religion to that of Jesus, not about Jesus. So that of Jesus, not about Jesus, meaning those who subscribe to the vision of the social gospel would pay attention to what Jesus was pointing towards, what was important to him, and what he called out to his followers as right relations and corruption, instead of worshiping Jesus as a savior. We see early Unitarian Universalist movements echoing Rauschenberg's cry. When Universalists gathered for a general convention in 1911, they created a commission on social service. That was in response to Rauschenberg. The secretary of the commission was Clarence Russell Skinner, and he drafted a declaration of social principles for the Universalist on behalf of the commission. It began with this preamble: throughout all agencies of the church, we shall endeavor to educate and inspire the community and the nation to a keener social consciousness and a truer vision of the kingdom of God on earth. This document called for an economic order which shall give every human being an equal share of common gifts of God. In addition, all that he shall be earned by his labor. It called for a social order in which there shall be equal rights for all, special privileges for none, the help of the strong for the weak until the weak become strong. Some of this language sounds a little dated, but you get the drift. It called for a moral order in which human law and action shall be the expression of a moral order of the universe. And it called for a spiritual order, which shall build out of the growing lives of living men and women the growing temple of the living God. This commission's declaration was adopted in 1917 by the convention as a basis for its social witness work. Actually, within just a few years of the publication of Christianity in the Social Crisis, virtually every mainline denomination created some type of bureau or department or federation of social service. So you may remember Unitarians and Universalists were separate until they merged in '61. So that's what our Universalists were up to, and our Unitarian forebearers were also busy as well. John Hayes Holmes was a prominent Unitarian. He was instrumental in the formation of the NAACP and the ACLU. He was an ardent pacifist prior and during World War I. This meant he fell out of favor with the American Unitarian Association when he wouldn't fall in line with other ministers and support the US president and the war. David Bombauer reflects on how Holmes saw religion as a process of social change and the church as an agent of social change. Bombauer describes this as a shift from concern about God to concern about humanity. Holmes believed religion needed to be responsive to what was happening in its day, and he called this modernism. Holmes came on a little stronger than Rauschenbusch and was critical of Unitarianism, while Skinner, who was that Universalist, he grounded his ideas firmly in Universalism. Holmes wanted a revolutionary and militant church. He called congregations and Unitarianism to active agents, as he said, the body of those who are saviors of the world from evils which it assails. He brought a really strong ethical lens, and he wanted the church to be more in the world, recognizing that every question in the world is ultimately a religious one. Holmes called for pacifism, collectivism, socialism, and internationalism as a contrast and to combat the harm and the evil of militarism, individualism, capitalism, and nationalism. When I read those, I was like, ooh, God, how is it that history really does repeat itself so much? Some of this language may sound familiar to you too. You can also hear some of this language of the social gospel when you think of Martin Luther King's words. In 1958, King wrote, "It has been my conviction since reading Rauschenbusch, I always call him Berg, I apologize, just butchering the man's name. It has always been my conviction ever since reading Rauschenbusch that any religion which professes to be concerned about the souls of men and women and is not concerned about the social and economic conditions that scar the soul is spiritually morbid religion only waiting for the day to be buried." We're hearing some of this now, like what's the relevance of the church? What's the relevance of the church? Will we have any relevance if we're not responsive to the world we're actually living in? Those of you who have looked on Wikipedia or know about Unitarian Universalism realize we're a small denomination. We have just over 1,000 congregations throughout America. And we're also in the midst of a movement of progressive religious denominations that long for a more just world and the end of systemic oppression. I think we obviously need to be hooked up with those other progressive liberal movements and congregations across other faiths. History, as I said, is imperfect. It's an imperfect world, and to some degree, we constantly repeat ourselves. Paul Razor, who wrote a book called Faith Without Certainty, Liberal Theology in the 21st Century, writes about the liberal social impulse that came to the surface in the social gospel movement. He notes the importance of the work and how we fell short. Once again, this isn't an uncommon story in many social movements. He says the social gospel was promoted in large by a perceived need to respond to several serious social crises, including widespread labor conflict and urban unrest. Theologically, the movement was grounded in the teachings of Jesus, which were interpreted as social teachings and applied to social issues of the day. The liberal theological perspective called for a better society, and the liberal Protestant churches were eager to help create it. They sought a new social spirit based on Christian love, and they supported economic reforms such as profit sharing and regulation of child labor. Some liberal clergy got involved in the labor movement, in urban political reform, or on social projects such as the Hull House, which was one. We also had, I think, a house such as that here in Minnesota. It was a way of bringing people out of poverty into a home, a large home, and creating a community there that helped to lift everybody up. Razor says, but while its contributions to theology and social change were significant, the social gospel was basically a middle-class movement. It retained the liberal emphasis on a gradual reform, and for the most part, it stopped short of advocating any radical social change. I think we're learning a lot these days about social movements and how sometimes they held back when the going got really tough. So these past few years in our denomination, we've been examining how we've fallen short. We've examined how we stopped short of advocating for any radical social change. We've been called out by people of color within our denomination and those who left us in the 1960s when they felt abandoned by the Unitarian Universalist commitment to racial justice. We're now on a path of renewal, of soul searching, of listening and following those in our denomination who have been historically marginalized. This isn't just an act of radical inclusion. I believe it's an act of our faith that we cannot be whole or liberated until all of us are liberated. I mentioned that commission way back in the early 1900s, led by Skinner in the by Skinner with the Universalist. The Unitarian Universalist Association continues to create commissions. Those of you who have been around for a while have heard of them. In 2017, a commission on institutional change was established to examine racism and white supremacy culture within our own denomination, within our own systems at the Unitarian Universalist Association. 3 years later, the commission published the report in a book called Widening the Circle of Concern, which bring forth ideas that support long-term cultural and institutional change that redeems the essential promise and ideas of Unitarian Universalism. And in 2020, another commission titled the Article 2 Study Commission. I can't say I love the titles of the commissions, but that's my own bias. Kathy's chuckling. The Article 2 of the Unitarian Universalist UUA bylaws, principles, and purposes is the foundation of the work of the UUA and its member congregations and covenant communities. It is the covenant, this article, this part of the bylaws is actually the covenant to which all of our congregations and covenanted communities pledge themselves. So it might sound a little technical, but it's actually quite deep. The commission was charged with reimagining our shared values, our inspirations, our purpose, and our foundational covenant. For quite some time, those of you may have sensed this, but there's been this critique about the order of our 7 principles. The first, at this point, is the inherent worth and dignity of each person, and it concludes with how we are part of an interconnected web of all existence. And many have commented on that sort of emphasizes individualism and how beautiful it would be if those were actually switched. But I think that realistically, it's doubtful that this commission will result in the same format of a list of principles, but I know that we are looking at ways to articulate the faith of this time, and one that is bolder and takes more risk. Skinner's book, The Social Implications of Universalism, speaks to today with as much relevance as it did back then in the earlier part of the century. He says, only those theologies which frankly and persistently align themselves with the world can logically enter the great Reformation of the 20th century. I was in conversation with a minister, Ellie Kirkpatrick, a UU minister, Ellie Kirkpatrick, because she also wrote about the social gospel, and she grappled with the challenge of this alignment and how we as people of faith can move forward with love and work for justice. She says, I can't tell you I know what salvation will look like or even what we should hope for. And honestly, it makes me want to sit back and wait until there's a clear vision, until I know exactly what I can do to be a part of history in the making. But then I remember Martin Luther King and John Lewis and thousands of people who fought for justice didn't know the way either, and that didn't stop them. We're called into the social gospel movement, she said. We're called into salvation we collectively help to create, called into a movement that is unknown, but needs us to take risk because we don't know just because we don't know what just might make history. We can't just join the movement when the way forward is clear. We can't despair. We can't give up or break into tears. We must forge ahead, because that is how we build societal salvation. She points to Rebecca Solnit, who says, there is no path forward, but going forward creates the path. There's no path forward, but going forward creates the path. Ellie continues, and whether we like it or not, we will make the path. But whether we choose safety or salvation is up to us. I hope today we choose salvation. So I'm curious, we only have a few minutes. We have about maybe 5 minutes or so if people want to share a little bit. I'm curious about if there's parts of the social gospel or UU theology as you know it that you use as an inspiration or reminder in times such as this, which will come again and have been in the past, in order to get yourself to move onto that path, that unknown path. Is there anything that you use or that comes to mind for you that you hold dear that helps you move forward? Maybe you have to sit with it for a while. Lori's got her hand up. Do you have a mic? Lori, will you introduce yourself before you speak? Those of you online, please feel free to participate as well.
I'm Lori, and the first thing that popped into my mind in answer to your question is the abolitionist movement to end slavery, and how courageous and activist people were to bring about that social change.
Yeah, thank you. And during a terrifying time to do so, right? Yeah. Is there anybody online? I was thinking about, we had an Action and Justice meeting last week just with the leadership of that team, and we were asking the question about, like, why does one even do social justice work, social action? And, we were discussing about the transformation that occurs in us when we engage, and that how it helps us plug into some sense of hope and action and be around those who are putting their energy and their hearts and their bodies in the line of social change. So I hope that we can do that more as a congregation moving forward. You quiet bunch online, nobody there, Linda Sue?
No, I'm not seeing any hands raised at this point.
Well, then it sounds like a good time to sing. Our closing hymn is 1014. We are answering the call of love. Just like before, we'll have the hymn leaders up here. People at home will be muted. You can sing along as loudly as you'd like. Those of us in person, please rise in body or spirit and wear your mask while you sing.